Hello! In this tutorial, we are going to take our mixing up to the next level. We are going to talk about some different effects and techniques we can add to our recordings to make something cool. If you have never recorded music before, you should watch part 1 and 2 of this series to get the basics down first. In our first two videos, we used Reaper to record our songs. For this video, we're going to do things a bit differently. This video is going to be much more general about things you can add to your track, so that you could try out a different DAW or try some free plugins in Reaper. I promise you that all the effects that are mentioned in this video can be found online for free, or will be included as standard into your DAW of choice. Open up your DAW and record some tracks. I'm going to use my tracks and mix from the previous video. Here's how it sounds just now. I would really like to add some drums, but I can't drum, and I don't own a drum kit, and I also live in a flat. The solution here is to use MIDI drums. MIDI is data about a piece of music that a computer plays with the sound of an instrument. Rather than storing audio, MIDI stores information about pitch, rhythm, and velocity. We can use MIDI to add instruments we don't have to our mix. I'm going to add a MIDI drum kit to my track. There are two ways that we can create music in MIDI format. We can draw the notes in ourselves in the piano roll, which you'll find in most DAWs, or we can use a MIDI keyboard to play the notes that we want. You can also use a score writing software, such as MuseScore, and export the file as a MIDI. With MIDI notes, we can control the specific timing, pitch, and velocity of each note. If you record a performance on a MIDI keyboard or instrument, you can quantize your performance, which will align each note to the beat. Now that I've got my MIDI drums, my track is finished and I can mix. If you want to build upon the skills that we covered in our last video, we're going to need to understand how the effects we're going to add work, why we're going to use them, and what their overall purpose is for serving our mix. The first new effect I'm going to add is compression. Compression can be quite difficult to understand, and for a beginner, can sometimes be difficult to even hear the difference that compression makes. The basic idea of a compressor is that when the signal's volume reaches a threshold, the compressor engages and it turns the signal down. The signal can then be turned up post-compression, which overall means that the quiet sounds of the track are louder and the louder sounds are quieter, and so the signal has been compressed. By controlling how quickly and by how much the signal is turned down, a compressor can completely change the sound of a track. The first control we want to set with our compressor is the threshold. This controls how loud the signal must be before the compressor engages. Turn the compressor on and slowly bring the threshold down until you can hear that the sound has changed. A little bit of compression can give nearly any track a slightly fuller or tighter sound. We can bring the threshold way down so that the compressor is engaging frequently. On instruments like guitars, this will create a very tight, snappy sound. I'm going to bring the threshold on my drum kit down quite low to give it some energy, and just a little on my vocals to make them sound fuller. I'm also going to add a little to my bass guitar to even out the volume across the performance. On a compressor, we also have controls for attack and release. Attack controls how quickly the compressor engages when the volume reaches the threshold. The higher we set the attack, the slower the compressor will engage. Release controls are how long the volume will be turned down once the compressor engages. The more release is turned up, the longer the volume will be turned down for. By setting the release higher, we can get an overall smoother sound and control the peaks of the attack. By having the release shorter, you can hear the effect of the compressor more often, and therefore hear the effect of the attack more prominent. By setting a fast attack, a small amount of the loud signal will slip through. This would lead to a spike in the signal, which we would call a transient. This will make the track sound snappy. By setting a slower attack, more of the original sound will slip through. This will lead to a livelier sound, or a bouncy sound when combined with a fast release. It's important to make sure your release and attack are working together for the sound you're trying to achieve. For a beginner, it can be easier to hear by turning the threshold down, setting your attack and release, then setting your threshold to just low enough that you can hear it engage. From here, you can tweak the signal until you are hearing what you would like to. Another important control to understand on a compressor is the ratio. This is how many decibels the signal will be turned down by for how many decibels it exceeded the threshold. So for example, with a 1:2 ratio, for every decibel above the threshold the volume reaches, it will be turned down by 2 decibels. Once the compressor engages. If it exceeds the threshold by 3 decibels, it will be turned down by 6. Lower ratios will create subtle compression, while higher ratios will naturally create a more noticeable compression effect. I recommend using a 1:2 ratio for a subtle effect. The final control we need to know on our compressor is the output volume, or makeup gain. This turns the volume back up after the compression. We can use this to lower the peaks of our signal whilst keeping the overall volume. We can use this to turn our overall volume back up after it was turned down by the compressor. Here is how my track sounds before and after compression. Distortion or saturation is the product of a signal being louder than the available headroom. When this happens, the top of the signal gets cut off or clipped, leading to the waveform being jagged or even square-shaped. To our ears, this sounds distorted. This is an effect that will be familiar to guitar players. This track, I used a distortion pedal to overdrive my guitar sound. When we intentionally use distortion in a mix, we normally refer to it as saturation. Because the loudest transients in the waveform are being chopped off, saturation effectively compresses the signal. Therefore, just like with compression, it can be used to level out or fatten up a track. The main use case of saturation is to add flavour and colour to the sound. For this track, I'm going to add some subtle saturation to my drums. Let's take another look at our EQs. There's a lot going on in my track just now, and the sound is a little muddy. On the EQ of my guitars, I'm going to pull the bass frequencies down a little bit so that there is more room for the bass guitar and kick drum. As for the bass guitar, I'm going to duplicate the track so that I can mold the low end and the detail separately. On the low end, I put a low pass filter to completely remove the high end, then shape the low end to sound full without being boomy. On the high end, I've brought down the low end frequencies and adjusted the rest of the spectrum to give an articulate sound that doesn't clash with my guitars. The next thing I'm going to add to this mix is some processing on the master. These effects will alter the sound of the whole mix. First, I'm going to add a subtle compressor to my master. I'm going to set a slow attack and a fast release and keep the ratio at 2:1. Then I'm only going to bring the threshold down as far as I can hear the effect. For this track, I feel this adds a little life and energy. However, it doesn't always sound appropriate. The final thing I'm going to add is another EQ, just to adjust any overall frequencies that have built up too much in the mix. The order of these effects is mostly up to your own taste and the sound of the mix. There is no hard and fast rule. Here's the track before and after the master effects. As mentioned in the previous video, the best way to learn what works and what doesn't is to experiment and break the rules. Some cool ideas to try. Try double, triple, or even quadruple tracking guitars and vocals. Try adding delay, reverb, or distortion to your master bus, or onto a full drum kit. Try using MIDI to automate parts of the mix, such as panning. Try mixing in mono and only set your panning at the end. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this short introduction to bedroom production. By following along, you should now have a solid base to begin working on your own music and making it sound awesome. The purpose of this series was to be succinct and get you started as quickly as possible, and as a result, there are 1001 things that could be covered at this level that had to be left out. However, watch this space for future tutorials expanding on what I've shown you so far. Thanks for watching.